This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Annie Coleman in St. Louis, Missouri, in February 2006. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 13. Well, I catched my breath and most fainted. Shut up on a wreck with such a gang as that. But it warn't no time to be sentimenterin'. We'd got to find that boat now. Had to have it for ourselves. So we went a-quakin' and shakin' down the starboard side. And slow work it was, too. Seemed a week before we got to the stern. No sign of a boat. Jim said he didn't believe he could go any further. So scared he hadn't hardly any strength left, he said. But I said, come on. If we get left on this wreck, we are in a fix, sure. So on we prowled again. We struck for the stern of the Texas and found it, and then scrabbled along forwards on the skylight, hanging on from shutter to shutter, for the edge of the skylight was in the water. When we got pretty close to the cross-hall door, there was the skiff, sure enough. I could just barely see her. I felt ever so thankful. In another second I would have been aboard of her, but just then the door opened. One of the men stuck his head out, only about a couple of foot from me, and I thought I was gone. But he jerked it in again, and says, "Heave that blame lantern out of sight, Bill." He flung a bag of something into the boat, and then got in himself and sit down. It was Packard. Then Bill, he come out and got in. Packard says in a low voice, "All ready, shove off." I couldn't hardly hang on to the shutters, I was so weak. But Bill says, "Hold on. Do you go through him?" "No, didn't you?" "No. So he's got his share of the cash yet." "Well, then come along. No use to take truck and leave money." "Say, won't he be suspicious what we're up to?" "Maybe he won't, but we got to have it anyway. Come along." So they got out and went in. The door slammed to because it was on the careened side, and in a half-second I was in the boat, and Jim come tumbling after me. I out with my knife and cut the rope, and away we went. We didn't touch an oar, and we didn't speak nor whisper, nor hardly even breathe. We went glidin' swift along, dead silent, past the tip of the paddle box and past the stern. Then in a second or two more we was 100 yards below the wreck, and the darkness soaked her up, every last sign of her, and we was safe and knowed it. When we was 300 or 400 yards downstream, we see the lantern show like a little spark at the Texas door for a second, and we knowed by that the rascals had missed their boat, and was beginning to understand that they was in just as much trouble now as Jim Turner was. Then Jim manned the oars, and we took out after our raft. Now was the first time that I begun to worry about the men. I reckon I hadn't had time to before. I begun to think how dreadful it was, even for murderers, to be in such a fix. I says to myself, there ain't no tellin' but I might come to be a murderer myself yet, and then how would I like it? So I says to Jim, the first light we see we'll land 100 yards below it or above it, in a place where it's a good hiding place for you and the skiff, and then I'll go and fix up some kind of a yarn and get somebody to go for that gang, and get them out of their scrape, so they can be hung when their time comes. But that idea was a failure, for pretty soon it begun to storm again, and this time worse than ever. The rain poured down and never a light showed. Everybody in bed, I reckon. We boomed along down the river, watching for lights and watching for our raft. After a long time the rain let up, but the clouds stayed, and the lightning kept whimpering, and by a flash showed us a black thing ahead, floatin', and we made for it. It was the raft, and mighty glad was we to get aboard of it again. We seen a light now away down to the right on shore, so I said I would go for it. The skiff was half full of plunder which that gang had stole there on the wreck. We hustled it onto the raft in a pile, and I told Jim to float along down and show a light when he judged he had gone about 2 mile, and keep it burning till I come. Then I manned my oars and shoved for the light. As I got down towards it 3 or 4 more showed, up on a hillside. It was a village. I closed in above the shore light, and laid on my oars and floated. As I went by, I see it was a lantern hanging off the jackstaff of a double-hull ferry-boat. I skimmed around for the watchman, a-wonderin' whereabouts he slept, and by I found him roostin' on the bitts forward, with his head down between his knees. I gave his shoulder 2 or 3 little shoves and begun to cry. He stirred up in a kind of a startlish way, but when he see it was only me, he took a good gap and stretch, and then he says, "Hullo, what's up? Don't cry, bub. What's the trouble?" I says, "Pap and Mam and Sis and—" Then I broke down. He says, "Oh, dang it now, don't take on so. We all has to have our troubles, and this'n'll come out all right. What's the matter with 'em?" They're... Are you the watchman of the boat?" "Yes," he says, kind of pretty well satisfied like. "I'm the captain and the owner, and the mate and the pilot, and watchman and head deckhand, and sometimes I'm the freight and passengers. I ain't as rich as old Jim Hornback, and I can't be so blame generous and good to Tom, Dick, and Harry as what he is, and slam around money the way he does, but I've told him a many a time that I wouldn't trade places with him, for, says I, a sailor's life's the life for me, and I'm derned if I'd live 2 mile out of town where there ain't nothing ever going on, not for all his spondulicks, and as much more on top of it. Says I broke in and says, "They're in an awful peck of trouble, and—" "Who is?" "Why, Pap and Mam and Sis and Miss Hooker, and if you'd take your ferry boat and go up there—" "Up where? Where are they?" "On the wreck." "What wreck?" "Why, there ain't but one." "What, you don't mean the Walter Scott?" "Yes." "Good land! What are they doing there, for gracious sakes?" "Well, they didn't go there a purpose." "I bet they didn't. Why, great goodness, there ain't no chance for 'em if they don't get off mighty quick. Why, how in the nation did they ever get into such a scrape?" "Easy enough. Miss Hooker was a-visitin' up there to the town." "Yes, Booth's Landin'. Go on." "She was a-visitin' there at Booth's Landin', and just in the edge of the evenin' she started over with her nigger woman in the horse ferry to stay all night at her friend's house, Miss what you may call her, I disremember her name, and they lost their steerin' oar and swung around and went a-floatin' down stern first about 2 mile and saddle-bags on the wreck, and the ferryman and the nigger woman and the horses was all lost, but Miss Hooker she made a grab and got aboard the wreck. Well, about an hour after dark we come along down in our trading scow, and it was so dark we didn't notice the wreck till we was right on it, and so we saddle-bagsed, but all of us was saved but Bill Whipple, and oh, he was the best creature. I most wish it had been me, I do." "My George, it's the beatin'est thing I ever struck. And then what did you all do?" "Well, we hollered and took on, but it's so wide there that we couldn't make nobody hear. So Pap said somebody got to get ashore and get help somehow. I was the only one that could swim, so I made a dash for it, and Miss Hooker she said if I didn't strike help sooner come here and hunt up her uncle, and he'd fix the thing. I made the land about a mile below, and been fooling along ever since, trying to get people to do something, but they said, 'Why, in such a night and such a current, there ain't no sense in it. Go for the steam ferry.' Now, if you'll go and— By Jackson, I'd like to, and blame it, I don't know but I will. But who in the dingnation's a-going to pay for it? Do you reckon your Pap—" "Why, that's all right. Miss Hooker she told me, particular, that her Uncle Hornback—" "Great guns, is he her uncle? Looky here, you break for that light over yonder way, and turn out west when you get there, and about a quarter of a mile out you'll come to the tavern. Tell him to dart you out to Jim Hornback's, and he'll foot the bill. And don't you fool around any, because he'll want to know the news. Tell him I'll have his niece all safe before he can get to town. Hump yourself now, I'm a-going up around the corner here to roust out my engineer." I struck for the light, but as soon as he turned the corner I went back and got into my skiff and bailed her out, and then pulled up shore in the easy water about 600 yards, and tucked myself in among some wood boats, for I couldn't rest easy till I could see the ferry boat start. But take it all around, I was feeling rather comfortable on account of taking all this trouble for that gang, for not many would have done it. I wish the widow knowed about it. I judged she would be proud of me for helping those rapscallions, because rapscallions and deadbeats is the kind the widow and good people takes the most interest in. Well, before long here comes the wreck, dim and dusky sliding along down. A kind of cold shiver went through me, and then I struck out for her. She was very deep, and I see in a minute there warn't much chance for anybody being alive in her. I pulled all around her and hollered a little, but there wasn't any answer, all dead still. I felt a little bit heavy-hearted about the gang, but not much, for I reckoned if they could stand it I could. Then here comes the ferry boat, so I shoved for the middle of the river on a long downstream slant, and when I judged I was out of eye reach, I laid on my oars and looked back and see her go and smell around the wreck for Miss Hooker's remainders, because the captain would know her Uncle Hornback would want them. And then pretty soon the ferry boat give it up and went for the shore, and I laid into my work and went to booming down the river. It did seem a powerful long time before Jim's light showed up, and when it did show, it looked like it was 1,000 miles off. By the time I got there, the sky was beginning to get a little gray in the east, so we struck for an island and hid the raft and sunk the skiff and turned in and slept like dead people. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14. By and by, when we got up, we turned over the truck the gang had stole off of the wreck, and found boots and blankets and clothes and all sorts of other things, and a lot of books and a spyglass and 3 boxes of cigars. We had never been this rich before in neither of our lives. The cigars was prime. We laid off all the afternoon in the woods talking, and me reading the books, and having a general good time. I told Jim all about what happened inside the wreck and at the ferry boat, and I said these kinds of things was adventures, but he said he didn't want no more adventures. He said that when I went in the Texas and he crawled back to get on the raft and found her gone, he nearly died, because he judged it was all up for him any way it could be fixed. For if he didn't get saved, he would get drownded, and if he did get saved, whoever saved him would send him back home so as to get the reward, and then Miss Watson would sell him South Shore. Well, he was right. He was most always right. He had an uncommon level head for a nigger. I read considerable to Jim about kings and dukes and earls and such, and how gaudy they dressed, and how much style they put on, and called each other your majesty, and your grace, and your lordship, and so on, 'stead of mister, and Jim's eyes bugged out, and he was interested. He says, "I didn't know they was so many on 'em. I hain't heard 'bout none on 'em, scasely, but old King Sollerman, unless you count stem kings that's in a pack of cards. How much do a king get?" "Get?" I says. "Why, they get $1,000 a month if they want it. They can have just as much as they want. Everything belongs to them." "Ain't that gay? And what they got to do, Huck?" "They don't do nothing. Why, how you talk. They just set around." "No, is that so?" "Of course it is. They just set around, except maybe when there's a war, then they go to the war. But other times they just lazy around, or go hawking, just hawking and Shh! Do you hear a noise?" We skipped out and looked, but it warn't nothing but the flutter of a steamboat's wheel away down, coming round the point. So we come back. "Yes," says I, "and other times, when things is dull, they fuss with the Parlymint, and if everybody don't go just so, he whacks their heads off. But mostly they hang round the harem." "Round a which?" "Harem." "What's de harem?" "The place where he keeps his wives. Don't you know about the harem? Solomon had one. He had about 1,000,000 wives." "Why, yes, that's so. I done forgot it. A harem's a boarding house, I reckon. Most likely they has rackety times in the nursery. I reckon the wives quarrels considerable, and dat crease the racket. Yet dey say Solomon de wisest man dat ever live. I don't take no stock in dat. Becase, why? Would a wise man want to live in the midst of such a blim-blammin' all the time? No, 'deed he wouldn't. A wise man had taken Bill a biler factory, and den he could shet down the biler factory when he want to rest." "Well, but he was the wisest man anyway. because the widow she told me so her own self." "I don't keer what the widow say. He warn't no wise man nuther. He had some of the dad-fetchedest ways I ever see. Does you know 'bout dat child that he is gwine to chop in two?" "Yes, the widow told me all about it." "Well, den, warn't dat the beatin'est notion in de world? You jes' take and look at it a minute. Dat's de stump dere. Dat's one of de women. Here's you. Dat's de other one. I's Sollerman, and dish yer dollar bill's de chile. Bofen you claims it. What does I do? Does I shin around 'mongst de neighbors and find out which un you de bill do belong to, and hand it over to de right one all safe and sound, de way dat anybody dat had any gumption would? No, I take and whack de bill in two, and give half on it to you, and de other half to the other woman. Dat's de way Solomon was gwine to do wid de chile. Now I want to ast you, what's de use of dat half a bill? Can't buy nothin' wid it. And what use is half a chile? I wouldn't give a dern for 1,000,000 in 'em. But hang it, Jim, you've clean missed the point. Blame it, you've missed it 1,000 mile. Who, me? Go 'long. Don't talk to me 'bout your points. I reckon I know sense when I sees it, and dey ain't no sense in such doin's as dat. Dispute warn't 'bout half a child, dispute was about a whole child, and de man that think he can settle a 'spute 'bout a whole child wid a half a child don't know enough to come in out in de rain. Don't talk to me 'bout Sollerman, Huck. I knows him by de back. But I tell you, you don't get the point. Blame de point. I reckon I knows what I knows, and mind you, de real point is down furder. It's down deeper. It lays in de way Solomon was raised. You take a man that's got only 1 or 2 chillen. Is dat man gwine to be wasteful of chillen? No, he ain't. He can't afford it. He know how to value 'em. But you take a man that's got about 5,000,000 chillen running around the house, and it's different. He as soon chop a chile in two as a cat. Dey's plenty more. A chile or two, more or less, warn't no consequence to Sollerman, dad fetch 'em. I never see such a nigger. If he got a notion in his head once, there warn't no getting it out again. He was the most down on Solomon of any nigger I ever see. So I went to talking about other kings, and let Solomon slide. I told about Louis XVI, that got his head cut off in France long time ago, and about his little boy the Dolphin, that would have been a king, but they took and shut him up in jail, and some say he died there. Po' little chap. But some says he got out and got away and come to America. That's good, but he'll be pooty lonesome. Dey ain't no kings here, is dey, Huck? No. Then he can't get no situation. What he gwine to do? Well, I don't know. Some of them gets on the police, and some of them learns people how to talk French. Why, Huck, don't the French people talk the same way we does? No, Jim, you couldn't understand a word they said. Not a single word. Well, now, I be ding busted. How did dat come? I don't know, but it's so. I got some of their jabber out of a book. Suppose a man was to come to you and say, "Parlez-vous Francie?" What would you think? I wouldn't think nuffin. I'd take and bust him over the head, dat is, if he warn't white. I wouldn't allow no nigger to call me dat. Shucks, it ain't calling you anything. It's only saying, "Do you know how to talk French?" Well, then, why couldn't he say it? Why, he is a-sayin' it. That's a Frenchman's way of sayin' it. Well, it's a blame ridiculous way, and I don't want to hear no more about it. Dey ain't no sense in it. Looky here, Jim. Does a cat talk like we do? No, a cat don't. Well, does a cow? No, a cow don't nuther. Does a cat talk like a cow, or a cow talk like a cat? No, they don't. It's natural and right for 'em to talk different from each other, ain't it? Course. And ain't it natural and right for a cat and a cow to talk different from us? Why, most surely it is. Well, then, why ain't it natural and right for a Frenchman to talk different from us? You answer me that. Is a cat a man, Huck? No. Well, then, there ain't no sense in a cat talking like a man. Is a cow a man, or is a cow a cat? No, she ain't either of them. Well, then, she ain't got no business to talk like either one or the other of 'em. Is a Frenchman a man? Yes. Well, den, dad blame it, why don't he talk like a man? You answer me dat. I see it warn't no use wasting words. You can't learn a nigger to argue. So I quit. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. We judged that 3 nights more would fetch us to Cairo, at the bottom of Illinois, where the Ohio River comes in, and that was what we was after. We would sell the raft and get on a steamboat and go way up the Ohio amongst the free states, and then be out of trouble. Well, the second night a fog begun to come on, and we made for a towhead to tie to, for it wouldn't do to try to run in a fog. But when I paddled ahead in the canoe with a line to make fast, there weren't anything but little saplings to tie to. I passed a line around one of them, right on the edge of the cut bank, but there was a stiff current, and the raft come booming down so lively she tore it out by the roots, and away she went. I see the fog closing down, and it made me so sick and scared I couldn't budge for most a half a minute, it seemed to me. And then there weren't no raft in sight. You couldn't see 20 yards. I jumped into the canoe and run back to the stern and grabbed the paddle and set her back a stroke, but she didn't come. I was in such a hurry I hadn't untied her. I got up and tried to untie her, but I was so excited my hands shook so I couldn't hardly do anything with them. As soon as I got started, I took out after the raft, hot and heavy, right down the towhead. That was all right as far as it went, but the towhead warn't 60 yards long, and the minute I flew by the foot of it, I shot out into the solid white fog, and hadn't no more idea which way I was going than a dead man. Thinks I, it won't do to paddle. First I know I'll run into the bank or a towhead or something. I got to set still and float. And yet it's mighty fidgety business to have to hold your hand still at such a time. I whooped and listened. Away down there somewheres I hears a small whoop, and up comes my spirits. I went tearing after it, listening sharp to hear it again. The next time it come I see I warn't heading for it, but heading away to the right of it. And the next time I was heading away to the left of it, and not gaining on it much either, for I was flying around, this way and that and the other, but it was going straight ahead all the time. I did wish the fool would think to beat a tin pan and beat it all the time, but he never did, and it was the still places between the whoops that was making the trouble for me. Well, I fought along, and directly I hears the whoop behind me. I was tangled good now. That was somebody else's whoop, or else I was turned around. I throwed the paddle down. I hear the whoop again. It was behind me yet, but in a different place. It kept comin' and kept changing its place, and I kept answering, till by and by it was in front of me again, and I knowed the current had swung the canoe's head downstream, and I was all right if that was Jim, not some other raftsman hollerin'. I couldn't tell nothin' about voices in a fog, for nothin' don't look natural nor sound natural in a fog. The whoopin' went on, and in about a minute I come a-boomin' down on a cut bank with smoky ghosts of big trees on it, and the current throwed me off to the left and shot by, amongst a lot of snags that fairly roared, the current was tearing by them so swift. In another second or two it was solid white and still again. I set perfectly still then, listening to my heart thump, and I reckon I didn't draw a breath while it thumped 100. I just give up then. I knowed what the matter was. That cut bank was an island, and Jim had gone down the other side of it. It warn't no towhead that you could float by in 10 minutes. It had the big timber of a regular island. It might be 5 or 6 miles long, and more than half a mile wide. I kept quiet with my ears cocked, about 15 minutes, I reckon. I was floating along, of course, 4 or 5 miles an hour, but you don't ever think of that. No, you feel like you were laying dead still on the water, and if a little glimpse of a snag slips by, you don't think to yourself how fast you're going, but you catch your breath and think, my, how that snag's tearing along. If you think it ain't dismal and lonesome out in a fog that way by yourself in the night, you try it once. You'll see. Next, for about a half an hour, I whoops now and then. At last I hears the answer a long ways off, and tries to follow it, but I couldn't do it. And directly I judged I'd got into a nest of towheads, for I had little dim glimpses of them on both sides of me, sometimes just a narrow channel between, and some that I couldn't see I knowed was there because I'd hear the wash of the current against the old dead brush and trash that hung over the banks. Well, I warn't long losing the whoops now amongst the towheads, and I only tried to chase them a little while anyway, because it was worse than chasing a jack-o'-lantern. You never knowed a sound dodge around so, and swap places so quick and so much. I had to claw away from the bank pretty lively 4 or 5 times to keep from knocking the islands out of the river, and so I judged the raft must be butting into the bank every now and then, or else it would get further ahead and clear out of hearing. It was floating a little faster than what I was. Well, I seemed to be in the open river again by and by, but I couldn't hear no sign of a whoop nowheres. I reckon Jim had fetched up on a snag, maybe, and it was all up with him. I was good and tired, so I laid down in the canoe and said I wouldn't bother no more. I didn't want to go to sleep, of course, but I was so sleepy I couldn't help it, so I thought I would take just one little cat nap. But I reckon it was more than a cat nap, for when I waked up the stars was shining bright, the fog was all gone, and I was spinning down a big bend, stern first. First I didn't know where I was. I thought I was dreaming, and when things began to come back to me they seemed to come up dim out of last week. It was a monstrous big river here, with the tallest and the thickest kind of timber on both banks, just a solid wall, as well as I could see by the stars. I looked away downstream and seen a black speck on the water. I took after it, but when I got to it, it warn't nothing but a couple of saw logs made fast together. Then I see another speck and chased that, then another, and this time I was right. It was the raft. When I got to it, Jim was setting there with his head down between his knees, asleep, with his right arm hanging over the steering oar. The other oar was smashed off, and the raft was littered up with leaves and branches and dirt. So she'd had a rough time. I made fast and laid down under Jim's nose on the raft, and began to gap and stretch my fists out against Jim, and says, "Hello, Jim, have I been asleep? Why didn't you stir me up?" "Good gracious, is dat you, Huck? And you ain't dead? You ain't drownded? You's back again? It's too good for true, honey, it's too good for true. Let me look at you, child, let me feel of you. No, you ain't dead. You's back again, live and sound, just the same old Huck. The same old Huck, thanks to goodness. What's the matter with you, Jim? You been a-drinkin'?" "Drinkin'? Has I been a-drinkin'? Has I had a chance to be a-drinkin'?" "Well, then, what makes you talk so wild?" "How does I talk wild?" "How? Why, hain't you been talking about my coming back and all that, as if I'd been gone away?" Huck Finn, you look me in the eye. Look me in the eye. Hain't you been gone away?" "Gone away? Why, what in the nation do you mean? I hain't been gone anywheres. Where would I go to?" "Well, looky here, boss, dey's something wrong, dey is. Is I me, or who is I? Is I here, or where is I? Now dat's what I wants to know." "Well, I think you're here plain enough, but I think you're a tangle-headed old fool, Jim." "I is I? Well, you answer me dis. Didn't you tote out de line in de canoe for to make fast to de towhead?" "No, I didn't. What towhead? I ain't seen no towhead." "You hain't seen no towhead? Looky here, didn't de line pull loose and de raft go a-hummin' down de river and leave you in de canoe behind in de fog?" "What fog?" "Why, de fog that's been around all night. And didn't you whoop and didn't I whoop, till we got mixed up in de islands, but one of us got lost and de other one was just as good as lost, case he didn't know where he was? And didn't I bust up agin a lot of dem islands and have a turrible time and most get drownded? Now ain't dat so, boss? Ain't it so? You answer me dat." "Well, this is too many for me, Jim. I hain't seen no fog, nor no islands, nor no troubles, nor nothin'. I've been settin' here talkin' with you all night till you went to sleep about 10 minutes ago, and I reckon I done the same. You couldn't 'a' got drunk in that time, so of course you've been dreamin'." "Dad fetch it, how was I gwine to dream all that in 10 minutes?" "Well, hang it all, you did dream it, because there didn't any of it happen." "But, Huck, it's all just as plain to me as—" "It don't make no difference how plain it is, there ain't nothing in it. I know, because I've been here all the time." Jim didn't say nothing for about 5 minutes, but set there studying over it. Then he says, "Well, den, I reckon I did dream it, Huck. But dog my cats if it ain't the powerfulest dream I ever see. And I hain't ever had no dream before that's tired me like this one." "Oh, well, that's all right, because a dream does tire a body like everything sometimes. But this one was a stavin' dream. Tell me all about it, Jim." So Jim went to work and told me the whole thing right through, just as it happened, only he painted it up considerable. Then he said he must start in and interpret it, because it was sent for a warning. He said the first towhead stood for a man that would try to do us some good, but the current was another man that would get us away from him. The whoops was warnings that would come to us every now and then, and if we didn't try hard to make out to understand them, they'd just take us into bad luck, 'stead of keeping us out of it. The lot of towheads was troubles we was going to get into with quarrelsome people, and all kinds of mean folks, but if we minded our business and didn't talk back and aggravate them, we would pull through and get out of the fog and into the big clear river, which was the Free States, and wouldn't have no more trouble. It had clouded up pretty dark just after I got onto the raft, but it was clearing up again now. "Oh, well, that's all interpreted well enough as far as it goes, Jim," I says. "But what does these things stand for?" It was the leaves and rubbish on the raft, and the smashed oar. You could see them first-rate now. Jim looked at the trash, and then looked at me, and back at the trash again. He had got the dream fixed so strong in his head that he couldn't seem to shake it loose and get the facts back into its place again right away. But when he did get the thing straightened around, he looked at me steady, without ever smiling, and says, "What do dey stand for? I's gwine to tell you. When I got all wore out wid work, and wid callin' for you, and went to sleep, my heart was most broke because you was lost, and I didn't keer no more what become of me and de raft. When I wake up and find you back again, all safe and sound, de tears come, and I could 'a' got down on my knees and kissed your foot, I was so thankful. And all you was thinking about was how you could make a fool of old Jim wid a lie. Dat truck is trash, and trash is what people is that puts dirt on de head of their friends and makes 'em ashamed." Then he got up and walked to the wigwam and went in there without saying anything but that. But that was enough. It made me feel so mean I could almost kiss his foot to get him to take it back. It was 15 minutes before I could work myself up to go and humble myself to a nigger, but I done it, and I weren't ever sorry for it afterwards, neither. I didn't do him no more mean tricks, and I wouldn't 'a' done that one if I'd 'a' knowed it would make him feel that way. End of chapter 15.